Space is precious, especially when it comes to growing houseplants. And in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about some space-efficient plants. Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Most growers could probably agree there are way more plants out there that we want to grow than space that we've got available for those plants to grow in. And we don't just need space, we need good space. We need a position in our apartment that offers the plants the conditions it needs to actually thrive in as well. And that is very, very precious. So sometimes it's really nice to have a compact plant that doesn't take up too much space, yet is quite impactful. And those are some plants I want to show you today. Of course, if you're growing your plant to maturity, as the plant matures, it grows larger and takes up more space. So of course, you can also just not grow your plants to maturity in the first place if you don't want them to grow too large because you don't have space available. To not grow them to maturity, you're basically aiming at giving these plants insufficient conditions. So most importantly, you probably want to provide them with less light than they would probably prefer. If you provide them with less light than required, the plant won't mature, grow smaller leaves, and so on. But it might also grow kind of leggy with very long petioles, so in itself doesn't really look nice. So I don't just want to show you juvenile plants because yeah, every plant when juvenile is kind of small and thus space efficient. I want to show you plants that even when you grow them and you grow them for many years, they won't actually end up taking up the whole apartment. So we don't want to just neglect our plants to keep them small. We actually want them to thrive but stay small. One good tip I can give you is to grow your plants as a trailing plant rather than a climbing plant. I very much prefer growing them as climbers. That suits my aesthetic preference better, and I kind of just like the growth pattern. But you can also grow a lot of these plants as trailing plants. For example, I've got this Scindapsus over here. I've had this for 3 years now. I think I've repotted it once, and it just kind of keeps trailing. I'll take the vines and I just kind of spin them around at the top again, you know, I take a long vine, I'll just spin it around, twist it into the pot kind of, so it doesn't just trail like 3 meters into another room, but rather create a lush display with this. So this is not just kind of compact, this is also very low effort. So if you have a nice spot where you can have plants trailing or hanging, then in general, they will always be space efficient. In nature, these plants would climb, and the climbing would kind of signalize to the plant to mature. Because it's not climbing, so we're growing it against its preferred growth pattern, let's say, it won't mature and get really, really large. But that's not news, right? I think trailing plants are probably more common than plants on moss poles. But even if you take this plant and you grow it up a moss pole, they won't grow really, really large. They will kind of almost shingle up the moss pole, and I put some B-roll in here. This is not my pole, this is one that AJ grew. But you can see that the plant kind of just shingled up that moss pole and stayed really nice and compact. So it didn't really branch out from the pole in itself. So all of the Scindapsus, you could have like 5-6 different types of Scindapsus on 5-6 poles. You can have them next to each other and they won't really interfere with each other, if you know what I mean. They won't spread with massive petioles, so you won't need to give each pole like a meter of space. So Scindapsus is a great plant for you to grow, either trailing or climbing if you're after something space efficient, and they don't require all too much light either. So they also tolerate low light conditions. So I think a really, really good first recommendation. Right, next one, we've got my Philodendron Brandtianum. Now this plant can mature and can grow decent sized leaves, let's say, but this plant is a plant that I'm personally having a really, really hard time with growing to maturity. And from comments that I got online, I don't think I'm the only one. So this is a plant that you could grow for many years. You can extend the moss pole, it can keep climbing, and it will still always stay fairly compact unless you provide it with absolute perfect conditions. So if you want a plant that grows vertically but stays compact because it's just really hard to mature it in an indoor setting, I think Philodendron Brandthianum is a really nice option because it also has nice little silver. Let me show you a comparison. Now, of course, in the grand scheme of things, they're more different and similar, but if we're just talking about a philodendron with silver markings, let's say, there's also Philodendron Sodyroi, and I've got a fairly mature version over here. Have a look at this. There's one petiole with a leaf here. There's one leaf with a petiole over here. I think I'm too close. This one plant takes up more space than all of the plants I've got in frame combined right now. You're trying to avoid a plant that matures quite quickly and easily, and with maturity grows really long petioles like this Sodyroi. I actually much prefer this Sodyroi juvenile, but it's just, I'm having a hard time not maturing it, if you know what I mean. It either grows, and when it grows it matures, or it doesn't grow at all if I give it insufficient conditions. So I'm having a hard time with this one. But the Brandthianum, I'm having a very hard time sizing up in the first place. So if you are worried about having a plant with that much spread in a couple of years' time, go for the Brandy instead of the Sodyroi, because you still got the nice heart-shaped leaves with the silver splotches on it, but you don't ever have to worry about this really outsizing your space. And that goes for most of these climbing philodendron. Philodendron Glorious, Philodendron Splendid, Verrucosum, even Milano a little bit. They have huge petioles similar to the Sodyroi, and I kind of managed them using twine, but they still take up a lot of space. However, there's one velvet philodendron that is also the easiest to grow and really space efficient, and that's Philodendron Micans. Now, my Philodendron Micans has actually taken over the fence outside, so I can no longer take it inside to show you. So we're gonna go out there. This over here is my Philodendron Micans. And sorry, I can't move it because it's taken over the fence over here. But you can see this plant is so nice and compact, right? But it still has the nice velvet texture, and it's just a really nice display. Also hides the pole really well. You can't really see the moss pollen itself anymore. Philodendron Micans was one of my very first plants. I've had it for over 4 years now, and it's never really been any larger than what you see or saw in that video over there. What I do with this plant, I just trail it up and down the moss pole, up and down. When it reaches the top, I'll just trail it back down, and then it goes up naturally again, and so on. So by now there's, I don't know, 20 vines or so going up and down, up and down, up and down. But the plant doesn't mature in leaf size. It doesn't grow ginormous petioles. So it's kind of just a really nice compact pole that I can put anywhere, and it doesn't take up too much space. It really optimizes that vertical space that I've got available, but it doesn't spread horizontally. So if every plant would be like the Micans, I could fit 5 times as many plants in my apartment. I could just have a wall and have all of these really compact poles next to each other, and I could fit heaps of them by utilizing that vertical space. If I compare that to the Sodyroi again, that Sodyroi takes up probably 4 Micans poles worth of space. So, you know, gotta choose wisely. So if you want something dark, something velvet, something easy to grow, I think Micans is a great plant, specifically on the moss pole, but you can also grow it trailing. Very similar to that. Now there's 2, there's Siltepecana and there's Siltepecana El Salvador. I think El Salvador is really just super common in Australia. It doesn't seem to be too common elsewhere in the world. I'll pop in a video of the El Salvador to my left, and you'll see that the El Salvador is much bigger with much larger leaves, much larger petioles, even though those 2 were getting the same conditions. So this plant is also one of my very first plants, and the exact same thing over here as with the Micans. These plants, for example, reach the top, and then I just take the vine and I just kind of pin it into the pole, hook it under like another petiole, or sometimes I use like a piece of wire or something like that. But basically, this plant just goes up and down. It is a nice compact display, right? It doesn't really spread far. The petioles aren't super long. You can see each leaf is quite small, but it is still impactful, right? It's not a juvenile plant. It's not like a ugly, empty looking plant with 3 leaves. It's a very nice, lush display. It even has the nice fenestrations that definitely show me that there's some sort of maturity involved, but it's not taking up that much space. So again, I think a great plant for somebody who, first of all, doesn't want to put too much effort into these plants, because, well, when it reaches the top, you don't need to do a chop and extend, you just trial it back down. So I do very infrequent chop and extends with this plant, really only once the bottom becomes a bit ugly. That's my trigger to do a chop and extend, but also for somebody who wants a very space efficient plant. So definitely go for the regular form Siltepecana over the El Salvador if you're worried about space. Alrighty, this plant has seen better days. That's because I actually chopped it very recently. I chopped it in between all of the nodes, and it's growing in my greenhouse. It is quite cool out there at the moment. So the plant isn't having the best time post-chop, but it is what it is. This is Philodendron Burle-Marx Fantasy. I love how little space this plant takes up, right? It's very much vertical, has hardly any horizontal spread. So it adds greenery, adds lushness, but it doesn't take up a lot of space. And honestly, I do nothing for this plant. Like every now and then I go through the greenhouse with a hose and that's it. Like so easy going. So I kind of love this, like, you know, easy approach, but I want to enhance it a little bit. I want to chop in between every single node over here and let every single node reshoot, so I'll end up having like 20 plants on here. That would be cool, right? I'm even growing this without a pot, so it doesn't actually take up any space horizontally, really just the vertical space. On that node, and I don't have one anymore, I gave it to Tim. I only have a mature form left, but Monstera dubia, when juvenile, is a beautiful shingling plant as well that stays very compact on the pole and doesn't really spread at all. Now, to keep it juvenile, you just need to provide it with insufficient light. Basically, light will trigger that plant to grow mature, and when it matures, it grows really large with really large petioles, really large leaves, so it then eventually becomes really hard to manage. But in juvenile form, it is actually really, really compact and space efficient. And look, when we're growing indoors, we're challenged with light, so not growing something to maturity should technically be easy enough. But I think with dubia, even if you don't grow to maturity and you're not giving it the greatest condition in history, it's still a really nice, impactful plant. It doesn't look like neglected, if you know what I mean. Alrighty, let's move on to this side over here, and this is really just an example. I think Syngoniums would be my next recommendation. You can see that it does obviously have longish petioles, right? Compared to the Brentianum, for example, it definitely has a slight more horizontal spread. But Syngoniums, they can mature and they'll eventually become like trilobial, or sometimes they have 5 lobes as well. But within an indoor setting, that's fairly unlikely to happen. That's something I usually observe like out in nature. I've got actually a nice tree on my street over here, and there's a Syngonium that has absolutely taken over. But even a mature leaf is still maybe only about this size, right? If I compare that to, for example, my Philodendron Glorious, who's got leaves this size, a Syngonium will stay fairly compact. And Syngoniums are great indoor plants. They're fairly easy to grow, especially this one. The variegated one is also super impactful and super pretty, and this has been on this pole for over a year now, so it's obviously not the fastest grower, at least for me as well. So I think, again, a nice compact and readily available plant that's also fairly easy to grow. So definitely a recommendation for a moss pole if you want to. Or it doesn't need to be a moss pole. Quite clearly, this one is filled with aeroid mix and the plant is still happy and growing up the pole. Alrighty, and then last but certainly not least, and I need to take it out because the way that this one currently receives light, it receives light from the top, you're kind of not seeing the nice part of this plant. This is Epipremnum mangala, so it's just a pothos, and this is, I suppose, my pothos placeholder plant. You can grow all of these pothos up a moss pole and they can actually mature quite nicely. Now when they mature, they can grow really large. I mean, you see this over here, they're fairly decent sized leaves for a pothos. Decent sized petioles as well, so it's not super tiny, but I think the leaves are so nice, and the impact of the leaves compared to the size of the plant, like, to me, is worth it, if that makes sense. And especially if you compare that to a variegated monstera, for example, this is much more compact and space efficient, especially when you're considering the length of petioles. So if you don't have enough space for a variegated monstera, for example, but you really want variegation, this one is going to be the more cost effective, easier to grow, and more space efficient option for you to grow. But you could also obviously do a Epipremnum aureum, like a marble queen or an autumn queen and so on. Like all of them can mature and grow really nice and large, but they're more space efficient than the monstera. So those are some plants that I personally have grown that I find fairly space efficient, but obviously this is not a comprehensive list. There's lots and lots of other plants out there that could end up being a nice space efficient option. So what I recommend you do next time when you find a plant, most likely find a juvenile version of that plant, right? In like a online or in a nursery or in a local plant store. You probably won't get ginormous plants, so sometimes it can be hard to gauge whether or not this plant will be space efficient because, well, when juvenile, they're all quite small. So I always Google the mature form of this plant. I want to see what this plant can grow up in nature, and if that plant stays fairly compact and small, even in perfect conditions out in nature, then chances are that it will stay even smaller in your indoor setting. If you see a plant with ginormous petioles, like anthuriums, for example, or Philodendron glorious, and you Google that and you see these monsters of a plant online, then the only way for you to keep it space efficient would basically by neglecting it, but then with neglect also comes a whole lot of other issues and just not a nice looking plant, right? Now, when you've Googled the mature form, also understand if that's a climber or a crawling plant. A crawling plant, Philodendron Plaumannii, Gloriosum, Pastaseinum and so on, for example, they can become really, really, really large with huge petioles and a huge spread. I personally have a really hard time with crawlers, not necessarily growing them, but I'm having a hard time integrating them into my space because they just take up so much horizontal space. I don't know how to create a nice display with them, so I kind of all just put them in my garden because I couldn't deal with them in here anymore because they weren't space efficient enough. However, my climbing plants I find much more space efficient, even if they are quite large with large petioles and so on. Utilizing the vertical space is always a great idea because, well, the horizontal space is already taken up by things like furniture and, well, you need space to walk through and so on. So, you know, always think about that, and when you Google that mature form, consider whether or not this can be grown climbing or not. Pay attention to the size of the petioles. Some plants can also grow really long petioles as a result of being provided with too little light, so kind of like looking for the light. So taking a plant that wants a lot of light but providing it with little light to kind of keep it small and thus space efficient might not actually end up making it space efficient. It might actually end up making it really leggy and actually less space efficient because the plant is looking for the light. Instead, get a plant that even when provided with the best possible conditions stays quite small, so has small petioles. So for example, the micans or the Siltepecana, they can mature further than what I've shown you, but very unlikely in an indoor setting. Of course, those are just a couple of examples, and I don't have all too many examples to give because I'm usually aiming for the polar opposite, but maybe you have some examples to give as well, and I would love for you to leave a comment down below with a plant that you like to grow because it's really nice and space efficient. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you got something out of it. I would love for you to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. Bye!